Good afternoon and welcome to the Finance, Budget, and Personnel Committee meeting of Tuesday, September 15, 2020. First order of business is to identify any possible conflicts of interest. The agenda is in front of you, and if you have any conflicts with anything on it, you're free to say so now. Seeing none, we'll move on to the next item, citizen comments. Are there any citizens here who are not addressing something on the agenda that would like to make a comment? If so, we invite you to come to the podium and give your name and give your comment. There being none, we'll move on to the next item, which is the consent agenda. On the consent agenda are the minutes of the September 1st, 2020 regular meeting, the bills and payroll, and report of personnel actions. They're in front of you, whatever your wishes.
Motion to approve the consent agenda.
Motion by Paschal, second by Wetzel. Discussion? There being none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Opposed, so carried. I never will get used to that delay. That's strange. Okay. Next up is consideration of items removed from the consent agenda. There were none. And an item added to the agenda is a request to recommend approval of budget resolution number 05-2020, transferring $1,004,666 from the general fund, other financing uses, to debt service, presented by Ron Allman, Finance Director. Ron?
All right, thank you, Ed. Just to follow up on our last 2 weeks of discussions, on our Moody's credit rating and the need for this budget resolution. So I've got some information probably a little bit beyond just requesting approval. So it kind of speaks to our ongoing issue here. So I've got some background there that the city's tax levy goes into two buckets. Broadly, one is the general fund for operations, personnel, operating supplies, kind of the day-to-day stuff, supplies, those kind of things. That's the amount that is really restricted by our levy limit guidelines, very restricted. The second bucket it goes into is our debt service. So it pays our annual principal and interest on approved debt for major construction projects. So buildings, fire equipment, police equipment, everything on the borrowing list. So the levy needed is total principal and interest due each year. And it's always kind of helpful to take a step back, is how should it work? Because we're kind of in this odd situation because of what we inherited. But debt service fund should be super easy. We have our payments for the year, we levy for it, we pay it. And then there's a little bit of variation, if we sell at a premium or our issuance costs are a little bit more. So basically it should just run close to zero every year with this little variation. Again, keep in mind that our TID debt, enterprise debt, is paid by those. So wastewater pays theirs, they're doing great. EMS pays theirs, they're doing great. TIDs pay theirs. So this is really, we're just talking about the general fund. And from the levy limit point of view, we can levy our actual debt every year. So it's not restricted like the general fund. Whatever our payments, the expenses in our debt service fund are, we're okay to levy it. So as you know, what we're trying to get to with our debt is that we flattened it out the last few issues so that we have kind of a sustainable growth rate for it, and then can start thinking about some of the bigger projects. So what's happened in the past is, we had TIF transfers filling in where there should have been additional levy. And then after we stopped that, we just have this deficit every year because the rates aren't high enough to pay our actual debt. So how we're paying for that, we're writing checks and we're basically burning through our cash reserves, as we kind of talked about with our Moody's. So right now we're just deficit spending in our debt until we can match up our actual debt payments with our levy amount. So this is the amount that existed at the end of 2019. So if you look on the audit report, that's the deficit in the debt service fund of 2019. We'll have an additional deficit in 2020. And then I put in your packet what our projected deficit will be in 2021 budget. And it represents a fair amount of our unassigned fund balance, the amount I note there at the end of 2019, the $3,611,000. Think of that as our cash. It's not a great comparison, but think of that as our available spendable fund balance. The remainder is still kind of an IOU that's coming in from our TIDs and other areas. So it takes a pretty big chunk out of our our cash. And before I ask for approval, if you turn to the page where I've got the 21 debt payments by issue, this in a nutshell kind of encapsulates what our annual problem is going to be. So what I've got there is the city portion of the debt totaling down to $4,404,508. That's primarily fixed debt. We can't refinance it. We can't refund it. We can't push it back. We can't do anything. And the amount we levied in 2020 on our levy limit worksheet is actually $3,212,000. So this is the structural deficit I keep talking about. Now that we've flattened out our debt, our payments are going to be hopefully roughly about the same, but our levy's just not there to pay for it. So I just make the note that this resolution just catches us up through 2019. It doesn't take into consideration 20 or 21. Before I ask for approval, I'll just see what you guys have for questions.
Pete,
Thank you. Ron, can you give us a guess as to how long this will take and what type of level are we really speaking of on an annual basis to overcome this problem?
Sure, you know, from a dollar point of view, it's going to be that until we bring the levy up, it's going to be $1 million a year, which we can't sustain because we don't have the cash to sustain that. How long it will take, if you remember what I said, Moody said, what's the political will to fix this? We can levy for the entire amount this year and catch up because we've got this long documented history of a decade where we weren't levying correctly, we were underfunding. We have the taxing authority to pay our debt, which is what we'd be doing. So we could levy it in the 2021 budget for the debt service part. We still have a deficit in the general fund also, but that's not as concerning because we can manage that. You know, we can cut down our expense increases. You know, we can manage that. That's more of a soft deficit, pray for no snow and those kind of things. But you know, this part of it is a hard deficit. We have bills. We're going to write checks for that amount this year, and we don't have the levy to pay for it.
anybody? Ron, you were saying when we were talking earlier that the reason we were under levying for it is that we were transferring money out of TIF and paying the debt with that TIF. And basically, the reason that we have a problem now is there's not any more loose money in the TIFs for us to do that with. But that money was never, I mean, it's not as if there was something illegal about doing that. There was absolutely nothing illegal about transferring that money, was there?
Correct. If you remember the discussion with our auditors, so you're correct that, you know, we were funding it with TIF money instead of raising our rates like we should have. And as far as your question, we have covered that previously with our auditors. So if it would have been a communicated strategy, you know, if we would have we would have had the agreement that, well, the TIFs are young in their life cycle, you know, the general fund's gonna pay for them for a little bit, and then when they catch up, you know, you can transfer, as far as I remember from that conversation, you can do it. Problem was, it was never communicated, and now when we pull this out, we have this huge hole that nobody knew about.
Okay, and that brings up another question. Some of the TIFs are actually generating a surplus in the revenue they put in. What's wrong with taking that surplus out and using it or balancing the budget? Is there anything wrong with that idea at all?
Yes.
It's
not intended for that purpose at all. And again, that's just dollars. It doesn't give us a tax rate sufficient to meet our ongoing obligations. And we've just gone through about a 2-year cycle of pulling it completely apart, and that's how it should stay.
We can't use those surpluses for any other reason. Like we can't, it's not the city's money. What happens when that debt is paid off by regular levy or by a regular increment? What happens? Where does that money go if it's a surplus at the end of the TIF lifestyle?
Sure. So when I say
lifetime.
Yeah, yeah, I understand the question. So when I say surplus, we have a surplus this year.
Yes.
And they're all doing well. So each TID has a total amount that it has to eventually pay back to get to break even. So
Correct.
it's generating a surplus this year, and then when it's paid all its debts, we close it. So there's never going to be a surplus. If there would happen to be a surplus in that final year that it's open, it goes back to the taxing jurisdictions.
Which is what I'm talking about. We are the taxing jurisdiction.
Right, but the TIFs collect the taxes from all taxing jurisdictions, county, tax, school. It goes in, so when they paid off their debts and they're back to even, we close it. There's never a total surplus. There's an annual surplus, which is good, which is happening now, but there will never be a total surplus.
But some of it, so you're saying that some of it that we actually use might belong to the other tax districts.
Correct. So when we set up a TIF, we get their sign off that we're going to collect the taxes for all jurisdictions and apply it to the TIF until the point where it's paid for itself, and then we close it.
Can we have a compensating balance fund and to save that money to pay off the debt earlier?
So
If it's meant for that TIF, can we use it strictly within that TIF to pay off the debt earlier?
yes, so there's, the answer is yes. So what's going to happen with one of our TIFs is they'll be back to even. I guess I shouldn't talk about hypotheticals. The timing of the debt's not going to necessarily match perfectly with the timing of the break even, but then, there's ways to do that at the end. But point being, when it gets to break even, we're done, and then we can close it.
All right, one more thing, and that is when we create a TIF, we do it based on the anticipated revenue from new construction or improvements in that district from one way or the other. Those things, generally speaking, the TIF makes the expenditures on the front end. We're passing the bond, we create the TIF, we pass the bond issue for the TIF, and we make the improvements on the front end. We build the railroad track, we fix the road, we build a building, we give a developer's incentive, whatever it is. But that money is spent up front. That money comes up front. That if there's a building or a development on that site, we don't start collecting taxes on it for 2 to 3 years until it's done. Sometimes we even capitalize the principal and interest of the first year. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I think we've done it for 2 years. Mm-hmm. I think we've done that. That money, we actually levy for that money. It's included in our debt service. Okay, but are you considering that part of the deficit that the fact that we paid the principal and interest the first 2 years, is that considered to be part of the deficit you're talking about?
First of all, from the way we're discussing it, we do not levy for TID debt. So think of it this way. We have a TID, we have this industrial park. All that property is now not technically on the city being levied. It's over in the TID, and we collect all taxing jurisdictions.
And that's where I think you're wrong. My understanding as an alderman, and the way it was always explained to us, was that we're going to lose money on that the first couple of years. We're going to pay for that. Generally, we're going to pay for it as it shows as debt service, and we pay for that debt service. It's included in part of the levy. And you're saying it's not?
That's correct. You're correct in saying it's not. So what would happen, you have an empty field example, we're going to make an industrial park. The TID goes out and borrows the money. So now the TID has debt, it does the improvements, and it's got to start making payments. So in that example, like you're saying, they likely don't have tax revenue. So they'll run at a deficit for a while until they get the tax increment and pay itself back. But again, it's all separate. It's all non-general fund levy.
Where does the money come from to pay the deficit that it's incurring the first few years? Wisconsin Rapids has a TIF or TID that's been in existence, I think, for 5 or 6 years now. And they built it without a firm developer's agreement. It's empty. They've demolished buildings, they've done utility work, they've done the whole thing. They're paying the debt on that now. Where are they getting the money?
Sure, so,
It's real cash, Ron.
right, I know. There's checks going out the door, I understand that. So what's the way the accounting would work for that, say they don't have anything, the city writes the check, it's attributed to the TID, and that's where these advances come in. So they technically have a cash advance that they owe back to the general fund. That's kind of the situation we're in now with TID 5.
Okay, but to get the money to write the check originally, unless they're funding it out of surplus or out of fund balance, they are levying the money from somewhere. Isn't that correct?
Can I jump
I'm
in?
not-
If I can just jump in for a second. You know, typically,
You were itching to get in, Steve, I'm sorry.
a what?
You were just itching to get in.
I've been dying to, yeah. I forgot what I was going to say though. No,
That was a nice trick.
Truthfully, if you know, take the industrial or business park idea that we talked about, where you get some land and then you put in street sewer, water, storm sewer, and those kind of things. It's typically expected in those circumstances that for at least a couple of years, maybe more, that the general fund is going to be advancing monies to the TIF district to cover what you're talking about before it starts to get development. I believe it just comes from general fund reserves. That's what I've seen happen before.
Correct, and so no, it's not levying because it's not paying an expense. So the expense is being accounted for on the TID side. It's basically an IOU. So it's just a cash transfer. It's not city levy paying their expense. It's basically converting an asset to an account receivable. You want to think about it in accounting 101.
So the reason we're gonna owe these several, I didn't see the whole thing here, I've been in meetings all day, but I didn't add up the total for the 3 years, but it looks to me to be about, what, 3.5 million over 3 years?
And what are you referring to?
The amount that we're gonna have to levy to fill the hole, as you call it.
So in the 2021 budget, if we bring the rate up to levy for our debt, that rate stays. So that's what I'm saying. If we levy it up, then we try to flatten our debt and our payments. So we won't have to raise our rate every year. We just need to get up to our current expense level, and then we can manage it and flatten it as best we can.
What I'm reminded of, I remember when my wife worked in accounting and she was in the lower level of the thing, and I teased her that that's where they kept all the wizards. I believe you were one of them, if I'm not mistaken. Because that basically, I think, is going to take a wizard to understand this, because I still believe that we levied for debt service to pay those bonds, to pay the principal and interest on those bonds until the TIF started doing its own thing. And at least that was our understanding of what we were doing.
Yeah, and it gets messy because we have one checkbook. The whole city's got one checkbook. So we're writing the check, but city levy's not paying the TID debt. The TID's paying for it, but they don't have the cash. So I think the accounting transaction, the city is basically trading their cash for an account receivable back from the TID. So it's all balance sheet related. We're not using, I want to be really clear that we've separated all that now. So there's not any crossover between TID finance and city finance other than this IOU that advance that we have and that we're winding down.
And I believe you had a recommendation?
If no further questions, I recommend approval of Budget Resolution 05-2020.
Mr. Handler? Is that the motion? Motion by Handler, second by? I'll second. Paschal? Any further discussion? Debate? Oh, Mr. Wetzel.
Thank you.
How many TIDs do we have open? We have 7 active ones.
I had to count on my fingers.
7 active TIDs.
Sorry, I'm just dying to play. I take my mask off. No,
All right.
we have 7 active.
So at some point, we took monies and we fronted it to these 7 TIDs to develop something. And all of those have been paid back by those TIDs?
So right now, the 2 TIDs that haven't advanced from the general fund is TID 7, which we expect will be paid off at the end of 2021, and TID 5, which we expect will be paid off at the end of 2023, and the others are positive cash, inception to date.
So the other 5 have already paid off all their debt?
They haven't paid off all their debt. They are positive cash, which is two different things. So, and I think to really see that, you'd have to kind of look at a kind of a detailed schedule. So, for example, if they took a lot of debt, they had a lot of cash. So they might be cash positive, but have a lot of debt.
Okay. But the monies that they're pulling in from those taxes are paying off what's necessary and then some, so we're actually probably paying advance on some of that debt for those TIDs.
Because the way we funded them was part of our city bond issue. It's 10-year notes and 20-year bonds, so it's not all callable. So in theory, they're kind of building up some cash to the point where, if we refinance or in the example of a state trust fund loan, we can pay those off early. So if they would build up enough cash or we'd refinance it, we would pay off their debt early if possible.
And how long is a TID open for?
Depending on the classification, I think it can go up to 33 years is the max. 20. Yep.
I'm just going to try to make sure I understand. Let's just pretend it's a 30-year TID. And let's pretend that we fronted a bunch of money or there's a loan or whatever. And let's say that TID develops much, much faster with much bigger and better development than we ever anticipated. And we hit to year 20 and all of a sudden all the debt is already paid. And all of a sudden we have this money that we're pulling in from all that tax, from the taxes on that TID, but everything's paid off. So at that point, we suddenly have more money than what we had debt. That surplus has to get split up between the taxing entities. So all 4 get their pie, their pie, slice of the pie. And then at that point you close it.
Sure, and there's two things that are kind of messy. There's the break-even amount and the debt amount. So if you think about the expenses that go into a TID, there's debt, there could be incentives,
Yep.
There's fees, those kind of things. So debt is different than the amount they need to break even. So in your example, if it's surplus, they get to break even a lot faster, we close it sooner, and that's going to happen with TID 5, for example.
And then to make things more complicated, again, we have that option of an extra year to utilize those monies for housing and those types of things.
Correct. The state just put in once, and we're looking at this for TID 2, which has been paid off for a while, but we're using their money to donor transfer to other TIDs. And they have the option of, instead of closing it, we can keep it open one more year and use that. It'd be about $110,000 for affordable housing options. So that's something Josh and I are kind of excited to try because it's a smaller amount, because we have all these other TIDs coming up in future years beyond that will be bigger amounts. So if we have a successful test run, we're hopeful we can repeat it.
And does that extension for affordable housing require approval by that board that approved the TID?
The Joint Review Board, I'm 99% sure they would have to approve it, but I'd have to look at the regs for that.
Yeah, I believe you're right.
But it's in their best interest because developing affordable housing with one more year of tax money potentially provides a much bigger tax base that they'll benefit from those houses that are put up.
Correct. In theory, everybody but us wants to close the TID as soon as possible because it puts it on the tax roll and they get cash back. So our goal is the opposite, to keep it open as long as possible because we can donor the funds to other TIDs. Ultimately, if a TID goes bad, it's the city's responsibilities 100%.
That would have to levy.
In fact, to add to that, the Joint Review Board has said more than a couple times in my time here, when are these districts going to start closing? We want to start seeing the benefit of what we participated in. So I think that with a good justification, they don't mind if we share from one TID to another to help pay them both off faster, but there's a point where they want to see closure.
I guess I have one further question, and it's probably just sort of a clarifying question. It's my understanding in the research that I had done regarding how the TIDs work, that if you have a piece of property that you're going to designate as a TID, and let's say that the taxes on that property are $100,000, at the time when that TID is established, that locks that taxing in. So the taxing entities are not giving up all their tax money from that. They're locking it in at that amount. And they're giving up their increased tax amount to pay off the debt. And I think a few times you said that they've agreed to give up their taxes on that. And so I just, for a clarification, it locks it in. They give up their increase of taxes on that, but they're still receiving the taxes on
They will
that property.
continue, they will continue to get the tax value they got on that $100,000 indefinitely. What they hope to get is a closure so they can begin to get the portion of the additional increment that's created.
So it goes from $100,000 to $1 million. That extra money goes to pay off the TID. Once it's paid off, then they get their pie of their piece of the $1 million pie.
Right, and going back to your earlier question, Tom, once it's believed that we have all the money we need to pay off our remaining debt and we have no other projects in the works that would fit with the project plan, we really should be, closing the TID. And absent sharing from one TID to another by state law, but otherwise, at that point, we really should be closing it out.
And we have successfully closed at least one, right?
We've closed 1, 2, 3, or 4, looking through the records. And for the terminology for what you're saying is the base value is set when it's established. That's always like the empty field example because the base value is basically zero.
Right.
In your example, the base value would be $100,000, and then the term is the increment. We look at the incremental increase over that as accruing to the TIDs.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Before we vote, there's one thing, Ron. You're taking this out of fund balance, $1,004,666. Yeah, the mark of the beast. This must be a really bad transfer. What does this do to our cash flow? I mean, what are we going to do about that? What's our current unrestricted, unreserved? I mean, that's where you're taking out of, right?
Correct. So if you look at the bottom of the memo, it tells you what at the end of 2019, because I'm basing this on the balance at the end of 2019, what our unassigned fund balance and our total fund balance were. So we're taking the $1.4 million out of those amounts at the end of, and cash, the closest proxy for cash is the unassigned fund balance number there. So it's taking a pretty large chunk of our spendable cash and spendable unassigned fund balance. So
Almost over a third of it.
correct. And so where the TIDs fit into this is they're repaying us. So our unassigned will go up and at the same time as it's going down because we're running at a deficit. So, but yes, it's what Moody's referred to as a narrowing of our liquidity, meaning we're going through our cash reserves quickly until we fix our debt service levy issue.
So of the remaining balance of about just under $4 million, be like $3,900,000 in the, that'd be coming out of the other one. So, but we have $7,527,000 in general fund total balance, and that's all committed reserved, right? That that other 7 million you're talking about here?
If you look at the audit report, so there's 3 parts to it. So the total is the 7 million. 1 second.
7,527,000.
7,527,000.
Yeah.
The unassigned is 3,611,000.
Right.
The non-spendable is the amount due from the TIDs, and that's about a little over 3 million, and that's being paid back pretty rapidly. And then a small amount for the approved continuing appropriations this year, which is about $200,000.
I'm really struggling on wanting to do this. I really am. I don't think anybody on this committee isn't gulping hard to swallow this 1,666,000, but
Sure, and keep in mind that the cash is gone. I mean, that money is spent. It's just a matter of, since we're not going to recover that in the debt service fund, this is an accounting entry because ultimately it's the general fund's responsibility. So we're just moving it. It doesn't have an effect on cash because the cash is spent. That's why there's a deficit in the debt service fund. This is just saying, well, the general fund's going to pay for it because it's their responsibility. And then we reset the debt service fund to zero. And again, in 2020, we'll have another deficit to worry
And
about.
again, but before council meets on this resolution, we need to know what the total liability is over those 3 years, what our total liability.
I don't understand the 3-year portion.
Well, you know, that we're gonna be, okay, we're gonna be raising the levy for 2021 by $1.4 million, I believe it was. Yeah, $1.4 million. Then, but are we raising the levy again in 2022?
Okay, so a couple things.
Just that one time?
This budget resolution is not a levy increase whatsoever.
No, I'm talking about what are we gonna look at in the future? And what are we looking at as a levy increase in the future?
So right now, that's what I have as on the projected budget sheet. So it's a structural deficit, and until we match up our levy rate with our debt service rate, you know, we're gonna have that $1.1 million deficit every year in the debt service fund. So if we would raise in 2020 enough to pay for it, then each year we'll start out at even in the debt service fund. Until we do that, we're gonna start off at 1.1 million deficit every year in the debt service fund.
Any further questions? Tom, go ahead.
So we're gonna have to raise an extra $1.1 million
Every
levy.
year.
We have to.
We don't have to, we don't have to do anything. I mean, I strongly advise it. We've got a documented history of why it's needed, and we've been downgraded. There really isn't an alternative other than, you cut so much out of the general fund, you'd have to go so far deep into the general fund before the first dollar even flows into the debt service fund. So there is theoretically an expense side to this, but it would that part would be so massive. I don't know if that would be palatable either.
And there's really two issues. There's an issue that we're short. There's also an issue that the fund balance is really low.
Yeah.
So really the 1.1 million increase provides the evening of that, but it doesn't resolve the really low, unless the TID money that you're saying that they owe us is going to take care of that issue.
Correct. And our overall fund balance in the general fund really isn't too bad right now. The 7.5 million, and knowing that the TIDs are paying us back, that in and of itself isn't too bad. It might actually be within our guidelines, if we look at total. It's just the fact that we are going to lose $1.1 million a year and be downgraded further if we don't correct it.
And then, go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, thank you. If I can sort of summarize what I think is being said here, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ron, but this entry basically puts us back to where we really are supposed to be. In other words, it's sort of a correction to show real life. And then whatever timeline we get out of this in, 2 years, whatever, 3 years, that's on us. But this is just putting us to where we belong.
Correct. And this is, again, it's just an accounting entry because a debt service fund typically wouldn't have this negative balance. So now we just need to move it over to the general fund and start fresh again.
And I think, are we going to have to make an explanation to Moody's when we come up for our next bond rating, I assume, as to why the numbers show what they do and what we did?
Correct. And if you remember, the Moody's credit report, stresses this pretty directly that the general fund will have to support the debt service until the issue is corrected.
Are you ready to go vote? If so, do we have a motion and a second on the floor to approve budget resolution number 05-2020, transferring $1,004,666 from the general fund to other financing use? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Make that a grumbling yes from me. The motion carries.
Thank you.
Was your grumbling
Positive,
on
yeah.
the positive or on the negative?
Yeah, with an asterisk, no. All right, next. Request to recommend approval of, to submit job descriptions for equipment operator and equipment operator 1 and 2 positions. The street division for the city's compensation evaluation. But Jen, you got my printer left out some things. I can't read what it left out. So go ahead, it's up to you.
Sure.
Oh.
Sure. The request is to review equipment operator 1 and equipment operator 2 to submit those for a compensation evaluation with McGrath Human Resources Group. Ultimately, these 2 positions were last evaluated back in 2017 as part of the original study that we put in place as of July 1st of 2018. At that time, you may recall, we made a decision to continue to work with McGrath for our compensation evaluations going forward for any type of reevaluation purposes. So earlier this year, I received a request to look at the compensation for a street division, the operator positions in general. And so that request came from staff. They had gotten some feedback from other cities. Specifically, it was both Wisconsin Rapids and Stevens Point. So what we did is we took that information and kind of did our own mini review just to see how competitive we looked with our 2 main comparables. So ultimately, when you look at these positions in general, there are 2 heaviest being the most employees in those 2 positions are equipment operator 1 and equipment operator 2. So equipment operator 1 sits in pay grade 123, equipment operator 2 sits in pay grade 125. And in looking at the street department in general, there are several positions that are somewhat related to these. So we've got some specialty positions, whether that is an inventory assistant operator or a sign tech operator or a specialized equipment operator. So we have jobs that are in similar pay grades that part of the year would be doing similar work for snow plowing purposes. And then part of the year, they're doing a little bit different work in their specialty areas. So what I've included in your packet is really the pay grades for pay grade 123, 125, and 126, so that you have a good understanding of what their current comparables are. In the initial review that I looked at, the positions in general, it isn't an exact apples to apples comparison. So if you look at, for example, the city of Wisconsin Rapids, they have various positions, but they have 1 pay grade for every employee that sits in that position. The city of Stevens Point is set up on a scale that's more like ours. However, the jobs weren't necessarily matching position by position. So with that, in looking at kind of an average, what you'll see is the equipment operator 1 did fall between those 2 comparables. We were slightly below, and then equipment operator 2 was really between the 2. So based on this, I think it's probably appropriate for us to submit the information to McGrath Human Resources Group to take a look at this, do a full compensation evaluation on it. Once that compensation evaluation is done, we'd bring the results back to the Finance, Budget, and Personnel Committee, and then look to potentially look at any increases. So at this point, what I'm requesting is really to submit the formal request to McGrath Human Resources Group for a compensation evaluation for equipment operator 1 and equipment operator 2, and then to have that discussion with McGrath if any of those other positions that are related, if they should be evaluated through this process as well. With that, I'm happy to take any questions, and Chris Hawley is here to answer questions as well.
Mr. Wetzel.
Okay, so, and maybe the discussion of this before would have been nicer than after, but the request is to equipment operator 1 and equipment operator 2, which, looking at this chart, which actually tells us where they fit, is 123, 125. Is there a reason why you have 126 also listed?
I listed 126 only because there's the specialized equipment operator and the fleet supervisor that are in pay grade 126. So actually the mechanics fall into that as well. But in looking at the department as a whole, if we have to make some adjustments, if we changed all of those equipment operator 2s, the specialized equipment operator would likely be affected by that.
So
I just wanted to give you a full picture.
We're opening up a domino effect of, let's look at these 2, but then also there's other half dozen and potentially change it.
Potentially.
Any further discussion? What's your pleasure? Mr. Handler. I think you said approve sending it
Is the
to
microphone on?
McGrath.
Mic on?
Yeah, that's what he said.
He's back.
And I'll second that.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I didn't have my mic on. But I would recommend that we approve and submit this particular request for pay evaluation.
Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Second by Mr. Paschal. Discussion? There being none, all those in favor say aye.
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 Aye. Opposed?
Nay.
Mr. Wetzel. Thank you. Any further discussion? Okay, it passes 4-1. And Jen, you didn't lose your turn. You're up next too.
I have lots of turns tonight.
Yeah, you do.
All right. So the next topic is our dental insurance renewal. We talked briefly about this at the last finance, budget, and personnel meeting when we looked at potentially getting approval to align the program. However, I didn't do at that point the formal recommendation for renewal. So as we had talked about at the last meeting, Delta Dental is our current vendor. What they have looked at this year, no plan design changes, no cost increase, continued plan. We've been very happy with their service and have had a good relationship with them. We're not intending to go out for bid for this particular benefit this year. And so we are recommending approval of the dental insurance renewal with Delta Dental effective January 1st for 2021.
What's your pleasure? Mr. Paschal?
I'll make a motion that we recommend the council approve the dental insurance plan.
Is there a second? Rebecca, that's a second, right? Okay, any discussion? If not, all those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? So carried. And we're talking about visual now, vision.
Next item is a Vision Hardware Insurance Plan renewal. As part of our benefits package, we offer a Vision Hardware Plan, which is basically hardware frames and lenses. We use this as a rider with our health insurance plan, so this provides employees with an option to get that coverage. The current plan vendor is National Vision Administrators. We've been with them for a number of years already, since I've been on board with the city, which will be coming up on 5 years. We haven't had any type of cost increase. So this year they did propose a cost increase with their renewal. The cost increase is 3% with no changes to the plan design. That 3% constitutes a 9-cent increase on a single plan and a 21-cent increase on a family plan. So seeing that they hadn't increased the rates for 5 years, and if we would approve this now, this rate will be locked in for another 4 years. Again, we have the chance to renew that every year. We felt there wasn't a need to go out for bid for this particular benefit. So our recommendation is that we're recommending approval for the annual review or renewal of the Vision Hardware Plan through National Vision Administrators for 2021.
What's your pleasure? Mr. Hindler? Motion to approve by Mr. Handler, second by Mr. Paschal. Discussion? Mr. Wetzel?
Thank you. What does this provide that's not included in health insurance?
So what an employee would typically do is if they go for an annual eye exam, regardless of where that is. So in network for us is Shopko Optical, Walmart, and the Eye Care Center on 4th Street. They would go into that exam. They would take both their security health plan card as well as their NBA Vision Hardware Plan. They would use the health plan for the eye exam and then the NBA hardware plan for contacts, frames, or lenses.
And then it provides them with free contacts,
Not
frames?
so there are limits in terms of what they can get. So there's specific limits on page 2 of your packet. For that item, it does talk about limits. It's not going to include things like anti-glare or scratch resistance or those types of things, but it does give you a limit per year that you can increase or that you can apply towards the cost of those contact frames or lenses.
Okay. And doesn't health insurance include some kind of a discount for items that are purchased within network, like a 30% discount from the Marshfield Clinic or something like that?
There's some limits with that. I think this is more feasible financially for most employees.
This kind of surprises me, not that I've seen regularly in other areas.
We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Rebecca, that was a yes?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Motion passes 5-0. And Rebecca's still up. This time we're talking about increased emergency responder leave, sick leave policy.
Sure. So with this topic, we've got Chief Owen and Firefighter Christopher here to be able to speak to as well. Ultimately, back in April, the city put in an emergency responder sick leave policy back in April, and that was really designated to help those employees that are designated as first responders, so police, fire, streets workers, park maintenance, city administrator, for example. What would happen if they would come down either with a COVID-related illness, or they were directed to self-quarantine due to COVID, or they were directed by Marshfield leadership to quarantine, that they would be able to be paid for up to 80 hours of leave. And ultimately what this does is it matches the Families First Coronavirus Act, the emergency paid leave scenario, so that those employees, although they don't get the full benefits of those federal regulations that were put into place, this help with that process. So recently, I received a request from firefighter Lance Christopher in regard to the fire department and how this impacts them. As most departments have an 80-hour work week, they don't. They average 56 hours a week, so up to 144 hours of pay period, depending on how their shifts fall. And so with that, the request that came through is they were happy to accept the 80 hours that we have, but also wanted to bring a request to this committee to increase that amount to at minimum 112 hours, which is more their average, or up to 144, which would meet the schedule if they would be out for a 2-week period. That would be the maximum hours that would work. Firefighter Christopher did do some review of this. He had reached out, I believe, to Wisconsin Rapids and found that's what they had done as well. And then just to ensure that you had full information, or at least a good understanding, I did provide some CDC background in there to look at what the typical quarantine requirements might be for somebody who's considered a healthcare provider. And so those requirements are listed. At this point, I would certainly turn it over to you to ask any questions. At this point, we're providing the information and looking at the committee for discretion in terms of whether or not they wanted to increase, whether or not you want to increase those hours from 80 to either 112 or 144.
Discussion, Mr. Wetzel.
Is it safe to assume that they would be paid out what they had been scheduled? Or would it just be an automatic maximum amount?
Well, it would be based upon hours that they were scheduled to work for whatever time period they were quarantined for or ill.
Mr. Passion.
The police are going to come back with a request to raise theirs because they also work more hours in a 2-week period. So would it be better to change the policy to reflect that it's for the number of hours worked in a 2-week period for all employees? I don't know of anybody else, street department, you guys work 80 hours. So
that would certainly be your discretion. I don't think they'd argue with that.
I would think that would be saving us having to go through this again in a couple of weeks.
No, we did request both of our bargaining units to opt in. So we'd have to get a formal opt-in for more hours from the police department. Potentially we could get that from the fire department here.
Mr. Member.
I think Alderman Peschel has a good idea. I think they should be done at the same time. These are very precarious times, and I think it's good to get ahead of the the problem. So I would certainly support that. Thank you.
I don't know about Steve. He puts in a lot of hours, you know.
Don't worry about it. It's all good. So the police department has opted in on this now, so
They've opted in at the 80 hours.
at the
And
80
so
hours.
I could connect with their union representatives and
So if
let
we
them
were
know
gonna
that you would
approve
offer higher.
this, we would need to include in the motion that, including the police department for 80 hours of basically COVID-19 leave.
Oh.
Right.
For
That's what
84
it,
hours.
that's what it would have to be.
Or for their 2 week, can you word it so it's 2 week, their average 2 week?
And this doesn't interfere with anything in the contract, in the bargaining agreements?
I don't believe so because this is a new benefit that we've never,
Is emergency leave in the bargaining agreement?
Side agreement.
It's a side agreement?
All right, I'm on there. Good evening, Lance Christopher. I'm the local president of Marshville 1021. Basic, my understanding is talking through legal counsel, this agreement would basically be a side agreement that we'd enter into with obviously the pressing time we've had with COVID. I guess with any of the agreements, we've had different agreements throughout all the communities. I haven't reached out to too many. I've talked to most of the comparables that we have. Some are handling it a little different. I do agree with, and I appreciate Mr. Peschel's idea with the 2 weeks. Just hitting on it very lightly, this could be as little as 72 hours for employees, depending on when they're interacting, what happens, what their schedule is. I'm not going to take the time to try to explain the whole schedule of the fire department or give you any examples, but it's based on 24-hour schedule and then it rotates days. So the agreement would be something that I'm sure both us and the department would be more than happy to have that side agreement. If a letter of recommendation is needed there, we would go through that and make sure that it fits every stipulation.
You sort of touched a nerve there. I think the staff knows how fond I am of side agreement. Can we put an expiration date on that side agreement?
right now, the expiration would be at the end of the year.
At the end of 2020?
Yes, so December 31st of 2020. The other piece that we'd need, or I would need some clarification on if we would choose to do this, but right now we're talking about the bargaining unit, but we also have other staff, whether it's a deputy chief or a lieutenant in the police department that are outside of that 80 hours. So I would look for clarity from you if you're looking for all employees, including represented, firefighters and police officers, just to make sure that we've got that full amount covered. Otherwise, currently, anyone who's in a non-represented role would fall under the 80-hour limit.
Mr. Wetzel,
Do I look like I want to talk?
yes, you do. You look like the words were just trying to get out from under that man.
This is, in my mind, a no-brainer. There are two departments that basically anytime dispatch calls them are put into a situation that they have no control over and putting themselves essentially in harm's way. So to me, it's a no-brainer. I'm just kind of wondering, obviously, there's one organization that's starting the bargaining process. That contract ends the end of the year. Don't know what the other entity's calendar is for theirs. I don't imagine it lines up the same. So, and I'm wondering if an expiration at the end of the calendar year in a mere 3 months is appropriate, or if it's something that should maybe go till the end of the current contract. I don't know.
So the current federal regulations surrounding the COVID benefits are all to expire at the end of the year. So for all employees that are covered by federal law that would fall under that window, then I would want to make sure that we're looking at that as well. So right now, I would say we're probably best to still end it at the end of 2020. to follow the federal law. If this gets extended further than that, I'm likely going to be back in front of you with additional guidelines to bring those forward, and then we could group these
We're
into
gonna
that as well.
We're going to still be talking about COVID in January. Yeah, I guess, you know, in alignment with the federal, that seems okay. And I think it should be not just for represented, but be for non-represented as well.
At 80 hours.
No, at whatever their average hours are.
Would someone here make a motion? I'm looking at you, Tom.
You want me to move?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll move. I would move to, are we approving this or does this go to the council? Are we moving to get this to council or?
This goes to council.
Everything really goes to the council, even under consent at least.
Okay, well, I move to approve the additional hours to represent the average hours worked within a 2-week period for both represented and non-represented until the end of the federal guidelines with the end of the calendar year. Did I miss something?
Yeah, if possible, I'd love it to say average scheduled.
Average, yeah, absolutely, average scheduled hours,
Thank you.
Is there a second?
provided that the police department goes along with it.
I'll second, or Chandler can second, or Rebecca
Okay,
can
the
second.
gentleman in the red mask, okay. Any further discussion? If not, all those in favor, please say aye.
I
Opposed? So carried.
Thank you very much.
Okay. And overview of the compensation program, which Jen was kind enough to hand out to us.
Thank you. So for the last item, what I wanted to do is just provide an informational session for you in regard to the current compensation program. I know as budget is coming forward, I want to make sure everybody has a strong understanding of how the program works. I understand that there have been maybe some random questions here and there, and want to make sure that everyone is covered by it. And so just to provide a little history, as you know, the current compensation plan went into place July 1st, 2018. It really our program consists of a policy and the wage scale that I provided everyone a copy of at the meeting this evening. It's also in the packet, but I know that's a little harder to read. So really what I wanted to do is just kind of walk through, and I think we'll just start with the big blue sheet first. If you recall back from 2018, we've put in this new scale that has 15 steps. Different positions are classified by pay grade and are grouped together. So our pay grades go from pay grade 120 to pay grade 139. Ultimately, in looking at this, you can see that in steps 1 through 15, step 5 is listed with an M. That's our midpoint or our market rate for the positions. So when we bring people in, we typically are hired between step 1 and step 5. Now that can vary a little bit depending on the amount of experience that they're coming in with. But when we're doing things like promotions or bringing someone into the scale, what we do is from a promotional standpoint, if somebody's moving from one pay grade to another pay grade, the way it works is they move to step 1 of the new pay grade or give them a minimum of a 5% increase, or the step closest to a 5% increase. So ultimately, those are kind of our options with that. When I am bringing somebody brand new into the organization, again, within that range of step 1 to step 5, if you remember in our old scale, we had some compression issues towards the lower end. And so what had happened in our old scale is our midpoint had been at step 4, and we really got people to step 4, but then weren't able to progress past that. So what that caused when we went into the scale in 2018 is some compression issues at the lower end. And so really when we're hiring, there is not only a review of what the person's experience has been, but we also look at the other comparable positions within the organization, sometimes within departments, sometimes a little bit broader if it's a smaller department. Make sure we don't have staff that are leapfrogging each other or coming in at a higher rate of pay than somebody who has been with us a significant amount of time or has a significant amount of experience. And so those are things that are always considered. What you might recall in the last couple of years is we had the 10-year bumps. So what we did to try to alleviate some of that compression was in January of 19 and in January of 20, we allowed people to move who had been in their position for 10 years or longer to move one step in the scale. So people that may have been, stuck at step 3 in the new scale would have moved to step 4 in July, step 5 in January, step 6 in July, and then potentially step 7 in January, because we had so much compression in that bottom end. So we feel like that had met the compression issues, were resolved from that scenario. You will notice if you look at the scale, or if you were doing the math, steps 1 through 5, if you looked at each one of those steps, there's a 2.5% adjustment between each of those steps. Steps 6 through 10 have a 2% adjustment, and steps 11 through 15 have a 1.5% adjustment. Once an employee would get to the top of the scale, they don't go any further in steps. However, if you adjust the scale, whether it's 1% or 2% or 0.5%, then that entire scale shifts. And when that scale shifts, what happens is that 0.5% or 1% or 2%, I'll use 1% as a guideline here. If we applied 1%, that would be applied to the midpoint. And then to keep the integrity of the scale, we would take that amount from the midpoint and then build in the percentages that are associated with each step. So 90% for step 1, 117.5% for step 15. So that's really how the program in general works. And I've talked a little bit about new hires. I've talked a little bit about promotions. If we have a new job classification, as we had talked about a little bit earlier with the street department, what we would look for is trying to figure out how we want to apply any adjustments to that step. And we're going to have, again, we're going to look at what the recommendation is. It might be to move people up a pay grade. It could be to move people up a step. It might be to provide a flat rate incentive to do something. So we have a lot of options going forward, but ultimately we want to make sure that we're keeping the integrity of the scale and then making sure that we're being competitive and fair with all of our staff. So I'm certainly happy to take any questions that you have and walk through that, so that as we get to budget, that you don't have any questions regarding the pay scale going forward.
What's your pleasure? Questions? I had about 45 minutes of this from Carlson Detman this morning, so I'm all these numbers are starting to run together for me, right? So,
Sure.
Steve?
And I think to add to what Jen said, I mean, even if you don't have any questions right now, feel free to reach out to her anytime. As she said, we're going into the budget process, and we talked just tonight, we talked about some job class reevaluations. We really want to make sure that you understand how this process works and what's all involved. So anytime, follow up with Jen or with me.
And that is exclusive of any cost of living adjustments we might make, but the cost of living adjustments are applied to market and spread throughout the.
Correct.
And those take place on a schedule of January 1st and July 1st of each
Nope.
year?
Typically just July 1st. So we did the
other one was a special case.
Right.
And how bad was that compression? I mean, was it serious? I mean,
we had, I guess if I think of some of our employees, as we brought new people into the organization, we may have had somebody in the past who had been here for 20 years working in their job and they were at midpoint. And we may have brought somebody new in who maybe had some experience, but they were brought in at step 1, maybe step 2 at the maximum.
How could they be only at midpoint if they were moving up one step each year?
That was under Carlson Detman. Since we've been on this plan, they do move a step typically every July 1st.
That's what I thought.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't need to get into that. We had to get into the cost of implementation today, but we don't have to worry about here. But go ahead, Steve.
Thank you. I think just to be fair to Carlson Detman, whatever you think about that plan, good, bad, or otherwise, the intent was to continue to move people past midpoint.
Mm-hmm.
The dollars weren't there, and so we didn't get there. So it wasn't like the plan was preventing people totally from getting there. It just wasn't happening. And we made a commitment with the McGrath plan to try and get people past midpoint if they were deserving of such increases in steps.
Yeah, and one of the things I have to say is the experience I've had with Carlson Detman at county this time is entirely different than what we went through last.
Good.
They've been far more, let's say, forthcoming about what their real motives were, or actually whether they had any motives at all. So that makes a big difference. So I'm very pleased with what's going on.
Good.
Go ahead, Tom.
Thank you. I want to go back to one thing that Mr. Barb just said at the end of his comment. You said they go up if, what was the end of your comment? They go up a step if,
I don't know that I can't remember what I said. I mean, they progress through the steps if they have a successful performance review. If
okay. So it's not a guarantee that everybody goes up a step, period?
No,
Okay.
no. I don't remember saying that, but that's a fact.
Okay. Real quick question related to a decision that we had decided not to make midsummer. And that was the increase to the full scale. What was the proposed increase at that point?
Was 1%.
And had we done that, what would that have done to those two scales that we're sending off to be reevaluated?
You know, I have the data from, had we planned to move forward with that. I don't have it in front of me right now, but I'd be happy to tell you what the impact would have been.
Because I think one of the things that we had talked about at that point, when we made the decision not to do that in July, or I think we made that decision in June, was that we would reevaluate that come fall. And so I'm wondering if that would just simply resolve that issue rather than having to have a reevaluation of job scale or job pays.
I think the only difference would be is that if you would choose to put in that 1%, it's going to affect all employees.
Mhm.
So it very well could correct this in relation to our comparables.
Because what you said was that if we do make some adjustments to a couple of the scales, it may have a domino effect to all of the scales, which a 1% increase being implemented would resolve that without having to pay company to reevaluate.
Sure, just to be clear, I think the domino effect would not necessarily be with the pay scale. It might be with positions within the street department.
And just adding, it is my intent to bring this back to the committee, the 1% scale adjustment at the next meeting, based upon the fact that in May you said you'd be willing to look at it again in fall, depending upon COVID and other circumstances of city finances, which I'm still talking with the city finance director about. Our proposal for wage increases for 2021 budget will simply be the steps and nothing more, no adjustments to the scale. So since money is budgeted for 2020, we'd like to get that 1% adjustment in, but we'll see if we can demonstrate the monies are there and if the committee is willing to consider it.
Thank you. Anybody else? Items for the next agenda? Mr. Handler.
Thank you, Mr. Wagner. One of the items I'd like to have on is sort of a historical perspective, our relationship with the utility and the city of Marshfield. I think it's been long overdue, and I know a lot of people have a lot of questions, and I would like to have that on the agenda. And the
If I
other thing,
understand it correctly, you're primarily concerned with the financial relationship?
I didn't hear you.
I'm sorry, if I understand you correctly, you're talking primarily about the financial relationship between the two entities?
I think we should concentrate on that, yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Which I'm assuming would mean things like pilot, dividends, those kind of things. What have we collected over the years?
I think so. That would be wonderful to do that. The other item that I have, Mr. Chairman, is, since we are the Budget and Finance and Personnel Committee, and I think Alderperson Spiros asked the question in the last council meeting, and since then we received, I believe, an agreement, a letter of agreement for services from Mr. Bard. It tells us, by the way, nothing. Sorry. But I'd like to have this brought up. If it isn't brought up at the council, I'd like to have this brought up and clarified as to who, what, and why. The basic interrogatives. It would eliminate a lot of
You want that for our
speculation.
next meeting?
Yeah.
Okay.
If I can jump in though for a minute. Ed, would it be okay just for a second? Councilmember Fisher brought this up under the items for future agendas at the last council meeting, and I do have it slotted for next Tuesday's council meeting. In fact, I'm talking to the city attorney tomorrow about how to, do agenda language to frame it and stuff. But we got the main points from what he wanted to see in terms of costs and so forth. So I'll go back and watch that tape from Facebook Live, but we'll definitely, if it's okay with you, we'll put it directly in the council agenda for next Tuesday.
That'd be fine.
Any further items? If not, the chair will entertain a motion to adjourn. Motion by Wenzel, second by Paschal to adjourn. All in favor, aye. Opposed, nay. We stand adjourned. Thank you.